At 4:15 in the morning, 18-year-old Brooklyn Farthing called her sister from a stranger's house in rural Kentucky. "Please come get me right now." She gave the address. She sounded calm, but something in her voice made it clear she wanted out. Her sister couldn't come. No license. Their cousin couldn't come. She'd been drinking, so Brooklyn stayed. Less than 2 hours later, she sent one final message to her ex-boyfriend. "Never mind, I'm fine. I'm going to a party in Rockcastle County." It was 5:30 in the morning. No one ever heard from her again. And within the hour, the house where she had been staying caught fire. The couch where she had last been seen was almost completely destroyed. Brooklyn was not inside, but she wasn't anywhere else either. Early in the morning of June 22nd, 2013, something happened on Dillon Court, just off Highway 421 in Berea, Kentucky. Something that investigators have never been able to fully explain. This is the story of Brooklyn Farthing. Brooklyn Farthing was born on August 26, 1994, and grew up in the small town of Berea, Kentucky, a place with a population of around 15,000 people, known mostly for its college and seasonal arts festivals that brought in visitors but never really changed the quiet rhythm of daily life. It was the kind of town where, especially in the 1990s, neighbors knew each other personally, where families stayed in close contact, and where children grew up surrounded not just by relatives, but by a wider sense of community. Until the age of 4, Brooklyn was raised by her mother, Shelby, and although those early years were shaped largely by that one relationship, things began to change when Shelby met a man named Randall, who gradually became part of the family, and Brooklyn took on the role of father in life. She was one of 3 sisters, with Tasha as the oldest and Paige as the youngest. And within that dynamic, Brooklyn quickly became someone who balanced energy with responsibility, drawing attention to herself without ever losing the trust of the people around her. People often described her as the kind of teenager who naturally became the center of attention, not because she demanded it, but because her presence made it almost inevitable. Her laugh was loud, warm, and instantly recognizable. And yet, at the same time, she was someone others relied on when things became difficult. She was small, around 155 centimeters. But that contrast between her size and her personality only made her more memorable. She combined camouflage with glitter, hunted and fished on weekends, and wore pink without hesitation. What stood out most was her instinct to help, volunteering, visiting nursing homes, showing up wherever she felt needed. At home, she would bake brownies almost every evening and bring them to her mother's room, where they would talk for hours. Paige would have to try again another time. Of course, people teased her about it, but it was lighthearted, the kind of teasing that never really hurt. After the exam, the sisters stopped by their older sister Tasha's workplace, a local restaurant where Paige complained about failing while Brooklyn shared her excitement, still holding on to the feeling of having passed. For Brooklyn, getting her driver's license wasn't just a practical step forward. It felt like freedom, like the beginning of something new, something entirely her own. That evening, the whole family gathered at their grandmother Bonnie's house to celebrate Papa Kenny's 70th birthday. The atmosphere was warm, intimate, filled with a kind of quiet awareness that moments like this don't last forever, especially given his condition. But for Brooklyn and Paige, the night wasn't meant to end there. They had other plans. A party out on Red Lick Road, just outside town, in an open field where gatherings like this often took place. It was the start of summer, loud music, groups of teenagers, most of them recent graduates like Brooklyn, hovering at that uncertain age between school and whatever came next. Their cousin was planning to go with them as well, and Brooklyn had already arranged to spend the night at her best friend's place after the party. She packed accordingly, a change of clothes, something comfortable to sleep in, her toothbrush, small details that suggested a simple, predictable plan. When she arrived, she was dressed for the occasion. A skirt paired with cowboy boots, a look that fit her as naturally as anything else she wore. By around 7 in the evening, they were already there, and for a while, everything unfolded as expected. Brooklyn stayed close to her group of friends, moving easily through conversations, laughter, and the rhythm of the gathering. But by around 8, Paige and their cousin decided to leave. It wasn't entirely clear why. Maybe the party didn't feel right. Maybe they were just tired. But either way, they headed home. Brooklyn didn't see it as a problem. She had a plan. Her friend was supposed to drive her back later. And from there, she would spend the night, rest, and meet another friend the next day. Everything seemed settled, but plans, as it turned out, shifted quickly. At some point during the evening, her friend decided not to leave with her after all, choosing instead to go home with her boyfriend, leaving Brooklyn behind. According to witnesses, she was visibly upset. Not dramatically, but enough for people to notice. And now, suddenly, the situation had changed. It was late. She had no clear way to get home, and the backup options she might have relied on, Paige and their cousin, were already gone. So she did what most people would do in that moment. She started looking for someone who could give her a ride. The first person she approached was someone she knew from school, but he was heavily intoxicated, in no condition to drive. Instead of walking away, Brooklyn suggested they try to find a sober driver together. She didn't want to leave him alone in that state, worried that something might happen to him. Eventually, they did find someone. Brooklyn recognized him. He was a friend of her ex-boyfriend Jarrett, a man named Joshua Hensley, who, at 23, was noticeably older than most people at the party. He offered to drive Brooklyn and her intoxicated friend home. By around 2 in the morning on June 22nd, Brooklyn left the party on Red Lick Road with 2 men, one of them being Joshua Hensley, who was behind the wheel. What happened next is known only in fragments, reconstructed later from partial statements and assumptions, rather than a clear, verified sequence of events. At some point, they stopped along Floyd Branch Road, possibly to look at horses in a nearby field. What exactly happened there remains unclear. At some point afterward, Joshua dropped off Brooklyn's intoxicated acquaintance at his home, leaving just the 2 of them in the car. From there, Joshua suggested that Brooklyn spend the night at his place, explaining that it was simply closer. Sometime around 4 in the morning, she arrived at a small house on Dillon Court, located at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac not far from the highway. And this is where an important detail comes in. At that time, the house had no electricity and no running water. The utilities had been completely shut off. It's unclear why, whether the property was in the process of being repossessed by the bank, already abandoned, or simply left in a state of neglect. But the most likely explanation is that it was undergoing foreclosure, and that Joshua was staying there without proper authorization. Whatever the case, It was not a place someone would feel comfortable staying overnight. Almost as soon as Brooklyn entered the house, she began thinking about how to leave. The building was dark, cold, and in poor condition, and the situation no longer felt safe to her. At 4:15 a.m., she called her sister Paige and asked calmly but directly, "Please come get me right now." She gave her the exact address. Dillon Court. Paige answered the call half asleep, but even in that state, she understood immediately that she wouldn't be able to help. She had just failed her driving test the day before and didn't have a license. She offered to wake their mother instead and ask her to come, but Brooklyn quickly refused. She didn't want to disturb her. Their cousin also declined to help. She had been drinking that evening and didn't want to get behind the wheel before sobering up. Both had their reasons, but it's not hard to imagine how many times they returned to that moment later. Paige would later recall that Brooklyn sounded calm on the phone, not intoxicated, not panicked. At the time, everything seemed relatively normal, as if she was simply trying to figure out where to spend the night and how to get there. She even asked Paige to leave the front door unlocked, saying she expected to be home soon. After realizing that neither her sister nor her cousin could come for her, Brooklyn said she would try to find another option and mentioned that she would text her ex-boyfriend Jarrett. That night he was working a shift at a factory, and it's in those messages that something changes. The tone becomes different, more urgent, less controlled. At one point she writes, "Please hurry. I'm scared." She tells him she is at Joshua's house on Dillon Court and asks him to come as soon as he can. Jarrett responds that he won't be able to leave until his shift ends, around 6 in the morning, and that it would take him about 20 minutes to get there. In practical terms, she would need to wait another hour, maybe a little longer. She says she'll wait. But just a few minutes later, at 4:26 a.m., she sends another message. "Can you come faster? Please hurry, I'm scared." Between 4:30 and 5:30 in the morning, Brooklyn continued calling and messaging friends, trying to find anyone who could come for her sooner than Jarrett. Only a small portion of those messages was ever made public, so we don't know exactly what she said to each person. But what does come through clearly is a consistent tone. She was afraid, and she did not want to stay where she was. And then something changed. At 5:30 a.m., Jarrett received another message from her phone. This time, the tone was completely different. "Never mind, I'm fine. I'm going to a party in Rockcastle County." A party at 5:30 in the morning in another county. The message stood out immediately, not just because of the timing, but because it didn't match anything that had come before. By that hour, most gatherings like the one she had attended were already winding down, people heading home, not driving out to something new. Jarrett asked who she was going with, but no reply ever came, and from that moment on, almost everything that followed had to be reconstructed from fragments. Primarily Joshua Hensley's account, combined with statements from Brooklyn's family, since the police never released full interrogation records or provided a complete, consistent timeline of events. What remains, even today, feels less like a clear narrative and more like a reconstruction built from partial, sometimes conflicting pieces. The next morning, Brooklyn was supposed to meet a friend at a car show, but when she failed to appear, something completely out of character for someone known to be reliable and communicative, concern quickly turned into alarm, prompting her friend to contact the family. What followed was a rapid escalation. Calls, messages, attempts to reach her from every direction, as relatives, friends, and acquaintances tried to understand what had happened. only to be met with silence, as she neither answered calls nor responded to messages. Within the first 24 hours alone, more than 1,000 calls were made to her phone, while cell tower data suggested that the device remained somewhere within a few miles of the house on Dillon Court. When the family attempted to report her missing that same day, the response from authorities was slow and cautious. Brooklyn was 18, legally an adult, and the initial assumption was that she had left voluntarily, a position reinforced by a public statement from a state police representative, expressing hope that she had chosen to leave on her own. While official action stalled, the family began reconstructing the timeline independently. Paige managed to identify who Brooklyn had left the party with, and after speaking with Jarrett, they learned about the unusual messages he had received that morning, messages that did not align with her earlier tone. Jarrett then provided them with Joshua's phone number, the man whose house Brooklyn had been at, and Tasha, her older sister, decided to call him directly in search of answers. Joshua's response was calm, almost detached, as he stated that he did not know where Brooklyn was, explaining that he had left the house around 5:30 a.m. to take care of the family's horses, adding that he had felt uncomfortable remaining alone with his friend's ex-girlfriend and did not want to be there when Jarrett arrived. According to him, when he left, Brooklyn had been sitting on a couch on the porch, smoking and talking about a party in Rockcastle County, the same destination mentioned in the message, and he had been gone for roughly an hour. That was his initial version. About 20 minutes later, he called again and added something else, saying that he was frightened and that Brooklyn had left behind several personal belongings, including her purse, a bag with clothes, and even her cowboy boots. Details that immediately raised questions for Tasha, who struggled to understand why her sister would leave such essential items behind in the house of someone she barely knew. Trying to make sense of it, she asked him to check the purse to see whether Brooklyn's documents and phone were still inside, but his answer only deepened the confusion. He said he couldn't get to the items because he was looking at them through a window, as the house itself was on fire. Not entirely, not yet, but the couch, the same one where he claimed to have last seen Brooklyn, was burning. Tasha immediately contacted the police, and the fire crew managed to contain the flames before they spread, leaving most of the house intact, while the couch was almost completely destroyed, reduced to its frame. At the same time, uncertainty remained over whether Joshua had called emergency services himself, and when he later explained the cause, he attributed the fire to a cigarette Brooklyn had been smoking on the porch, mentioning it almost casually, as if it were a minor detail rather than a critical part of the timeline. He had not mentioned it immediately, and when the sequence of calls was later examined, his statements appeared inconsistent, making it difficult to determine exactly when and how he chose to introduce the fact that there had been a fire at all. What remained clear, however, was that he was both the last person to claim he had seen Brooklyn and the one who introduced the fire into the narrative, while simultaneously insisting that he had not been inside the house at the time, claiming instead that he had been out taking care of horses, an alibi that no one was able to confirm in the absence of cameras or witnesses. When firefighters and police entered the house, they found Brooklyn's belongings exactly where he had described them. A bag with clothes, her keys, her boots, everything she had worn that evening, with the exception of two crucial things: the clothes she had changed into after the party and her phone. Brooklyn herself was not there. It was not until Sunday, June 23rd, that the family was finally able to file an official missing person report. And by that point, for those who knew her, it was already clear that this was not a voluntary disappearance. She had plans for the next day, plans for the future, and no reason to leave without her belongings, especially not without the driver's license she had been so proud of receiving just hours earlier. Investigators began by verifying the one detail that stood out in her final message: the supposed party in Rockcastle County, but found no evidence that such a gathering had taken place, nor any references to it in her previous messages, making that final text to Jarrett appear isolated and inconsistent with everything else. The case was eventually taken over by the Kentucky State Police, specifically Post 7 in Richmond, and from the outset their focus remained on the house on Dillon Court, where forensic specialists noted a critical detail. The property had no electricity, effectively ruling out common causes of fire such as electrical faults or malfunctioning appliances. A police spokesperson later stated that a fire of that nature could not have originated on a couch without an external source, leading investigators to classify it as suspicious. Police interviewed Joshua, people who had been at the party, the owner of the house, and others connected to the events of that night. But the contents of those interviews were never made public, leaving a significant gap in the official narrative. No arrests were made, and no formal suspect was identified, which meant that Joshua remained, at least officially, only a witness, despite being the last known person to have seen Brooklyn. Another detail added to the growing unease surrounding the case. Her phone remained active for up to 2 or even 3 days after she disappeared, receiving hundreds, possibly thousands of messages from friends and family, none of which were ever answered. According to cell tower data, the last confirmed signal from her phone placed it somewhere in the area of Blue Lick, roughly 40 minutes away from Jarrett's home, in a region known for its dense forests, uneven terrain, deep ravines, and scattered lakes, where searching for a single person becomes extremely difficult even under controlled conditions. Despite these challenges, search efforts began almost immediately, involving not only law enforcement but also volunteers who used tracking dogs, horses, and coordinated ground searches to cover as much territory as possible, while divers examined nearby bodies of water. More than 16,000 acres were searched in the first weeks. Dogs, horses, divers, coordinated ground teams. Nothing was found. The case quickly gained attention beyond the local area, with major media outlets covering the story and focusing on the same elements that made it so unsettling. The frightened messages, the sudden change in tone, and the unexplained fire. While flyers with Brooklyn's photo appeared across the town, turning the search into a visible collective effort. Despite this, there were no solid leads, and the investigation gradually slowed, with reports suggesting that Joshua was never subjected to a truly thorough interrogation, and that evidence from the house may not have been collected as carefully as it should have been. Within a month, active search operations were scaled back, leaving landowners with instructions to report anything unusual, while the case itself began to transition into what is commonly described as a cold case, even though officially it remained open and ongoing. Brooklyn was never found, and over time, what remained was not a clear narrative, but a set of competing theories attempting to explain the same limited set of facts. The most prominent of these theories centers on Joshua Hensley, with many believing that something occurred inside the house, that he may have made advances toward her, that she refused, and that the situation escalated into violence. an interpretation supported in the eyes of her family and others by the sequence of events that followed. Her requests for help, her statements that she was afraid, the sudden shift in tone in her final message, and the fire that destroyed the couch where he claimed to have last seen her, have all been interpreted as parts of a single chain of events rather than isolated details. Particular attention has been given to the nature of that fire, which appeared to have been limited in scope, destroying the couch almost completely while leaving the rest of the house largely intact, leading to speculation that it may have been intended to eliminate specific evidence rather than being the result of an accident. Joshua's own account has also raised questions as details in his story changed over time, including when he left the house, where he went, and whether he contacted emergency services, with at least one version involving a trip to a nearby gas station and a return to find Brooklyn gone. A narrative that differs significantly from his earlier statements. For many locals, these inconsistencies were enough to cast doubt on his account, especially given his familiarity with remote areas due to his work in road construction, which would have given him knowledge of isolated routes, little used roads, and locations where someone could disappear without being easily found. Some online accounts have suggested his family had connections to local law enforcement, a claim that remains unverified. In the absence of definitive evidence, the case remains unresolved, defined less by what is known and more by what cannot be proven. There is one more detail that often raises questions. In the same cul-de-sac where Joshua's house was located, there was also the home of Brooklyn's Sunday school teacher, someone she had known since childhood. In theory, she could have gone there and asked for help, but for reasons that remain unclear, she didn't. It's difficult to say why. It's possible she simply couldn't find the house in the dark, or that by that point she was no longer able to leave the property at all. From there, several theories begin to take shape. One of them suggests the involvement of a third party, an unknown individual who may have encountered her after Joshua left, assuming his version of events is accurate. But this raises its own set of questions. Who would have been there at that hour on a quiet rural road? And how could something like that happen in such a narrow window of time without leaving any trace? Another possibility is that what happened was an accident, something sudden and unplanned, such as an overdose, a fall, or an injury, followed by an attempt to conceal it. In that scenario, someone present may have panicked, hidden the body, and then set fire to the couch in an effort to destroy evidence. This idea, notably, does not necessarily contradict the first theory, and in some interpretations, the two overlap. The theory of a voluntary disappearance, on the other hand, is widely dismissed. The facts simply don't support it. Brooklyn would not have left without her belongings, without her documents, and certainly not without the driver's license she had been so proud of receiving just hours earlier. Law enforcement has remained cautious in its public statements, avoiding direct accusations and repeating a consistent message. New evidence is needed. New leads, new witness accounts, anything that could move the case forward. In the years since her disappearance, Brooklyn's family has continued to do exactly that. Tasha, her older sister, has given interviews, organized memorial events, and worked to keep the story visible. The family created a dedicated website, raised funds for a reward, and repeatedly asked the public to share any information, no matter how small it might seem. They return, again and again, to the house on Dillon Court. the last place where Brooklyn was known to be alive. In 2016, on the 3rd anniversary, they held a memorial service there, reading prayers, lighting candles, and releasing balloons into the sky, each carrying a message. Brooklyn's mother once said that part of her still wants to walk up to that house, open the door, and see her daughter inside, even while knowing on some level that this is no longer possible. And yet, she continues to go back because that place is the only remaining connection she has. Years later, in 2020, Joshua Hensley was arrested alongside 2 other men in connection with the distribution of illegal material involving minors. In 2021, he was convicted and sentenced to prison, though he was released in 2025 and remains under supervision until 2030. At first glance, this might seem like something that would bring renewed attention to Brooklyn's case, potentially raising questions about whether he had been involved in her disappearance. But public attention shifted elsewhere. One of the other men arrested in the same case, a professor at a local college, died by suicide while awaiting trial, and that became the dominant narrative, pushing everything else into the background. As a result, discussion of Joshua's past and his possible connection to Brooklyn's disappearance faded once again. Today, he is free, reportedly facing personal and financial difficulties, including a divorce and the loss of his home. Meanwhile, a reward of $14,000 remains in place for information that could help solve the case. For Brooklyn's family, hope has never fully disappeared. They continue to believe that one day the truth will surface and that the uncertainty which has defined their lives for so many years will finally come to an end. At the same time, it's impossible not to consider the weight carried by those who were there that night. Paige, their cousin, the friend who left early, and how often they must have returned to those moments, wondering whether a different decision might have changed everything. "My sister Brooke was strong, direct, and full of life," Tasha once said. "She loved animals and nature, but at the same time, she was just a normal girl. She loved pink, she loved makeup, and she was always ready to help anyone who needed it. She had a beautiful, deep voice, like something you'd hear in a country song, a voice that feels like it belongs in Kentucky. There isn't a day that goes by when I don't think about her." Brooklyn Farthing disappeared in Kentucky on June 22, 2013, sometime between 5:30 and 7 o'clock in the morning. She was 18 years old at the time, a white female with blonde hair and brown eyes, pierced ears, and a small mole on her left thigh. She stood approximately 155 centimeters tall and weighed around 48 kilograms. She was last seen wearing a gray t-shirt with a Madison County FFA logo and light blue denim shorts. Today, she would be 31. This is a case that still raises more questions than answers. There's her messages. There was location data. There was a person who was last known to see her, yet never formally treated as a suspect. And still, no resolution, no clear explanation for the fire, no confirmed sequence of events inside that house, no evidence that has been publicly connected into a complete picture. It leaves a lingering question, not just about what happened, but about why. Despite everything that seemed to be there, the case remains unsolved.